Hey friends, so I've been thinking a little bit about what coding looks like for me these days and what it looks like for a lot of us. It's changing. The process of building is changing, and I've spent some time away from building for a few years, and in the past maybe 4 or 5 months, I've started to get back into building websites, building marketing things, somewhat out of curiosity, but then also out of actual necessity to create some solutions to problems in our businesses. So I wanted to just talk for a minute about something I've noticed in myself. Really, I have been thinking about something that I've ended up calling dopamine-driven development, and I want to show you just a few things that have really come to the surface for me. Vibe coding is the term that a lot of us are seeing and hearing, and it's kind of this blanket term, as far as I can tell, that has to do with talking to create code rather than writing the code itself. It maybe doesn't have a firm definition. I'm not too sure. You can correct me or tell me in the comments if you want. But I've just noticed that I don't tend to say that I'm coding very often anymore. I've noticed that as I get more and more into this approach to development, I tend to say that I'm building. It's almost this distinction when I think about listening to books on Audible. I don't always say I read the book. It's weird. I try to think about a different verb. Am I listening to the book? Am I reading the book? Am I consuming the book? I don't know. I tend to default to saying I read a book, but it still feels a little strange. So when it comes to coding, I don't really know that that's the right verb for me right now. I'm not coding. I am building things. So that's the first thing that I just noticed as I've been spending some months doing this. The next thing is that the gap between the idea and the prototype is just so tiny at this point. Typically, there's this idea that happens, and then an amount of time you need to create the initial working prototype, or maybe call it MVP. What used to take hours even now takes minutes, which is pretty crazy. And what I've noticed is that dopamine is really on fire right now, because every time I have this really short feedback loop of an idea, typing in a prompt, and then letting a computer create the idea or execute the idea, it happens a lot faster than if I was sitting here typing all of the code. So it reminded me that we've got these acronyms that are used in our industry. We've got things like test-driven development, behavior-driven development, domain-driven design. There's all these little something-driven something. And that got me wondering if I have been accidentally letting dopamine drive my development decisions. And I wanted to be mindful of that. So quickly, dopamine is tied to wanting, not necessarily liking, and it spikes on anticipation, which is something that is really interesting to think about in the context of building things or coding things. And so in the article that I am referencing right now, I go into a little bit more detail, but basically this craving to have that short feedback loop come back around where I've completed something or I see the fruit of the idea, it persists even if the enjoyment of it goes away or starts to fade. And the loop is so short, I'm wondering how addictive it becomes. I don't know. But I have noticed that the feedback loops are super fast. Rewards happen much more frequently in coding or building than they did for me previously. There's a lot of novelty, there's a lot less friction until you start to need other dependencies, databases, environments, things like that. But either way, the friction is still way lower, and easily triggered cues. Some of this will make more sense if you dig into the article. But these are conditions for behavioral addiction, and they also describe a lot of the AI-aided building or coding. So the cycle for me is I kind of describe a thing, it generates some initial code, I test it or have it test it, fix anything that didn't work in the test, improve the thing, in some cases ship it, some cases not, and kind of just repeat. And that cycle is so fast to go through, especially if you're taking small bites of features and not just building massive things all in one pass. So what I realized is that the approach I've learned to take has a name, and I discovered this name very recently, and it is spec-driven development. For me, the way that I've adapted to this new tool set is to spend a lot of time thinking and chatting about the feature set, about requirements, about acceptance criteria, things like that, before any code it gets generated. If you're using Claude, or I think Codex has something, I know Cursor does, basically called plan mode. That's kind of what I'm talking about right now. It's where you spend time planning out as much as you can before you get to before you get to work. So you're creating these detailed specifications, any constraints, and then after you agree with the AI or tell the AI you're ready, it goes and does some stuff. I've noticed I spent a lot of time doing that, and this spec-driven development describes that process for me pretty well. So I've realized that they're kind of two different things, vibe coding and this spec-driven development concept. Maybe one is part of the other, I don't know. But it seems like vibe coding is sort of a catch-all, and that this kind of loose prompting is one end of a spectrum, maybe, and more spec-driven is maybe the other end of a spectrum. I don't know. One, though, is definitely more dopamine territory, and the other being a lot slower on purpose. Of course, slow in AI, in the AI era, is still not very slow. But it reminds me of this quote that I've seen floating around a lot in AI conversations. I love movie quotes, so I couldn't help but also reference Jurassic Park, where we got our boy scientist saying, or no, he wasn't the scientist, Jeff Goldblum, whatever his character was. Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. AI coding, AI building makes a lot of things possible. So I'm trying to slow down enough to ask if I should do certain things, not just if I can do certain things. So questions I've been sitting with, maybe you can too. Can these satisfying feedback loops become compulsive? I don't know. What about scope creep? If something is so easy to do, does scope creep become way more likely when just one more feature feels free, basically? And then Windows was entering into this state of flow, kind of being in the zone. When does it actually become avoidance? I've found myself just continuing on with more features or enhancements because I had kind of a flow that I was in, and I just didn't want to get out of it to then ship something for testing by another person. So am I avoiding another part of the process just because it's fast and I'm able to stay in the zone longer? I don't know. These are just things I'm sitting with. Friction was a feature previously, I'm realizing. Time, effort, cost, they used to be very natural governors in the process of shipping work. Now that primary constraint, I'm wondering, is it judgment? Is it a discipline to stop building even though you could keep building? Discernment, I think, is going to be a key ingredient to high functioning teams, definitely engineering teams, but teams in general who are building things for internal processes and tools or for client-facing processes and tools. And there's more information on all of this if you want to check it out. It's on my blog at ericregan.com, and would love to continue the conversation in the comments. So thanks for tuning in and listening along.